Hey everyone, welcome to NonTrivial. I'm your host, Sean McClure. In this episode, I take a look at the sordid history of the library. The library has been a beacon of knowledge and a marker of civilization for hundreds of years. But the library's journey from the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries to massive cultural institutions like the Library of Congress has been perilous. This is a journey that touches on many modern concerns we have around information, including propaganda, censorship, access, elitism, and the conquests of both political leaders and rich industrialists. To own the information society is exposed to is to own society itself, to control what people think and believe. The library has always been caught in the middle between the power struggles of the elites and a public hungry for knowledge, and the opportunities such knowledge brings. In this episode, we will use the library's history to showcase fundamental patterns related to unification, censorship, critical thresholds, growth and variation, replication and scale, growth and destruction, crossover opportunities, resiliency, and simultaneous discovery. And you thought a talk on libraries was going to be boring. Let's get started. The Immortal Library, Information, Resilience, and the Benefit of Turmoil. So this is going to be a talk on information, which is obviously a big topic in, today's news cycle, right? We just got the recent purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk. And so this is a good example of, a corporation taking over a major platform that is kind of the town hall of information. And so we got these issues about freedom of speech and what is allowed to be said and content moderation and who has rights to what and all this kind of stuff. So these topics come up all the time and it's really in the news right now. So this is kind of timely. But what I'm going to do to anchor our talk on information is the history of the library, because this week's book is called The Library, A Fragile History, written by two authors out of Scotland, Andrew Pettigrew and Arthur de Vedovin. And they are, university professors out of Scotland. They wrote this book called The Library, A Fragile History. So it's obviously about the history of the library, which might sound kind of boring to some, but really, I mean, we obviously in this podcast, I'm doing a book on a regular basis. And so reading is important to a lot of us. We like to read books. It plays a big role, but information in general plays a major role in society, right? Who owns the information? How is it promulgated? How is it, put forward? Who has control over it? Who has access to it? These issues come up all the time. And so as a nice kind of backdrop to that conversation, understanding the library, which is really, the storehouse of information, at least before the internet, especially, the place where you can get access to it. You can improve the opportunity, your stake in life by, knowing more and understanding opportunities, gaining skills and all that kind of stuff. So the use of that, the storing of that, the control of that, the access to information is a really important topic. And so that's going to kind of be an overlying theme throughout this episode. So as I like to remind all my listeners, if you head on over to patreon.com/nontrivial, you will see the visuals that I put together with my talks, because I have a slide deck that is put together that I use to anchor the conversations. You can see the nice visuals that I put together. So if you are a visual person, go ahead and head on over to patreon.com/nontrivial. And you will get a visual tour of everything that I say. So for those of you seeing the overview slide, you can see I have a number of topics I want to discuss on this episode. Literacy as a unifying force, literature as a practical tool, the purpose of being interested in things like literature and libraries, growth, incentive, reach, scale, this idea of expurgating text where you're going and burning books. We're going to talk about that. How the library rises out of the ashes and how it kind of reinvents itself. We'll talk all about opportunities, resiliency, targets knowledge, how you grow through destruction, some of the reasons why people put the library together and still continue to do things like this with information in general. And then, ultimately, why is the library still here? The physical library, why is it still actually, relatively popular? We keep thinking that new technologies or even political landscapes are going to wipe it out, and they just don't do that. It has this resiliency to it. So I think it's an interesting conversation. The patterns and concepts that I'll be talking about in this episode are ones that I mentioned in the introduction, right? Unification, censorship, critical threshold, growth and variation, replication and scale, growth and destruction, crossover opportunities, resiliency, and simultaneous discovery. A lot of these patterns I've talked about in other episodes. So let's see how they play out with respect to the library. Okay, again, this week's book is The Library, A Fragile History by Andrew Pettigrew and Arthur de Vedhoven. So I'm going to start with thinking of literacy as this unifying force. So if you want to, think politically, right? I mean, obviously, countries want to unify things for better or for worse, or whatever the motives are. And the way that you do that is you get people to basically buy into the same story. You get them to speak the same language, to read the same things. You need something to kind of anchor the unification, right? And Charlemagne would be a good example throughout history. Charlemagne, right, who made sure all his monasteries and bishops devoted their efforts to the study of literature and the teaching of it. So if you think about literature in general and the rise of the library and trying to get people to, essentially kind of speak and read and write the same language, or how did the quality of that language improve as opposed to just being scattered all over the place and everybody doing something different? Well, a lot of that comes from unification efforts. And so Charlemagne is an example where he wanted to, really take the West and Central Europe and unify it under a unified language, right? And so the monasteries were used, the scriptoriums in these monasteries were used to start to get really good at Latin and to get good at copying text and to do it with a standard, right? In other words, don't just, copy it however the heck you want. Have there be a quality standard to the replication of text. And the more standardized that is, the more you can unify around it because you know what to expect when you go to read something. You know there's going to be a certain quality. You know that the proliferation of information is happening, according to whatever agendas are in place. So the focus on education and writing and the proliferation of eventually books really started with a lot of the monasteries throughout Europe and the political forces like Charlemagne behind them that promoted the replication of text and the reading and the writing within those. So all of a sudden in history, there is this push, largely because of political reasons and unification, to put emphasis on education, on literacy, on writing, and to have storehouses of that information. And the monasteries were really the ones that acted as those storehouses of the information and the insurance that text was being replicated with quality standards. And so what we think of now with information and we'll get into obviously the internet and all the technologies later, none of that could have been achieved without the ecclesiastical network of monasteries that really started this idea that, hey, rather than just, having scripts scattered everywhere, we should have a protocol, right? We should think of information as being really important and powerful, and we should store it and we should put quality controls around it. So literature starts to be seen as this practical tool. And part of that is public access, right? The question arises, information is powerful. Obviously, we can think of that in a number of different ways. It can help the individual from a skill set perspective. The more you know, the more you can do. And it's got a power that just kind of storytelling by the fireplace doesn't have. It's you don't have to remember all the details. If it's written down, you can keep referencing it. The more you can replicate it, the more you can share it with others. Not everybody has to be at the bonfire to hear the story, right? So there's this power to it. So, but because it's powerful, the politics come into that. Well, who's going to own it? Who's going to control it? And who should have access to it? So, as public access grew, it turns out that books became less concentrated in the monasteries and more in urban areas. Because urban areas is going to have concentrations of people. There's going to be more people who want access to the education. Those urban areas are going to have professionals working in it. And those professionals are going to start to use that information to do their job. This is, definitely true of doctors and lawyers and clergymen. And actually the clergymen and merchants using them for everyday practice is really what kind of brought the back pressure needed to put a focus on literature and reading and writing, because it just became this very practical tool. And eventually universities and colleges, as well as cathedrals and churches, became the main storehouses of books. So whereas it was just these kind of monasteries, motivated by the Charlemagnes of the world before, now cathedrals, churches, universities, and colleges realized the power and the importance of storing information. And so those became the main storehouses. Also the promoters of public access to them. So what this makes you realize, or at least ask, is, what is the purpose behind this, right? So we already started off with that kind of unification political force that Charlemagne was bringing. So already, the purpose of literature was not necessarily for literature itself, right? It wasn't this recognition that, well, information is good and access to information is good and people should just be literate. It was more, the realization that if everyone is kind of reading the same thing and speaking the same way, and that information can be controlled, then there's some political benefit to that. And this is true for other reasons as well. If you think about universities having storehouses of books, is that because they want the education of their students to be better, or is it more of kind of an elitism thing? Okay. And I would say the latter, because the churches and universities chained a lot of their books. So it wasn't really about public access. It was very reserved. Only certain people could access the information. It wasn't easy. Obviously, systems hadn't been placed, hadn't been kind of invented or put in place, like indexing and all that kind of stuff, that you could access books easily. But, really it was about limiting the access, and it was kind of almost more for show. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but a lot of, the libraries eventually that got put together to store books, the architectural considerations were much more important than, what the books were or what was inside. It was really a show. And if you had, visitors to the state, you'd want to show off your testament to civilization and how civilized your country was. And the library would kind of be a way to do that. So there's this kind of access elitism trade-off, right? Where you have information, you're storing it, you want to provide access to that information, supposedly. But if you provide access to that, then, the quality might go down, books might get lost, things might get stolen. And so there's this kind of, well, it's not really about public access. I just want to have all these books here so we can show them off politically, economically, whatever. So anyways, there's, we'll get into what is the true purpose of doing things that on the surface seem really good, right? Access to information. People should have information. Oxford did not unchain its books until 1792, right? Oxford was founded in something like 1096. So this is hundreds of years after the founding of Oxford University. They didn't unchain their books until 1792. So it's interesting to think about what is the purpose of the library, right? Again, on the surface, it's this wonderful thing. It's public access. It's information, and this is how we tend to think of information in general without putting too much deep thought into it. It's just this, everybody should have information. Information wants to be free, right? But the use of it becomes very political very quickly. And the reason people build these edifices to civilization, to these storehouses of information, often have nothing to do with the public accessing that information. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you do allow the access, there are often there are definite benefits to that. So again, part of the downfall initially might have been, well, look, we've got these rare books and they're not easy to replicate. And if everybody can access them, then they're going to, get stolen, or people aren't going to return them, right? Which is still an issue. But in today's ubiquitous information, it's not that important. But access means growth, and this comes from growth and variation. So the chaining of manuscripts and books makes sense to some extent when they're scarce, right? But with so few reading, then the public interest in things like libraries, and even universities starts to wane because, well, nobody can really get access to the information anyway. But if you allow the public access, you get more input, you get more variation, more people are reading, the demand goes up, you get more ideas of what to stock inside those storehouses of information. And this is true of any type of growth process. The variation that you allow in is good. I mean, if countries open their borders, at least to some extent, history of the United States very much, right? I mean, the economy in the U.S., and a lot of countries can relate to this, would not be what it is today if you did not open those borders and allow a lot of the immigration to come in, because that adds variety and new ideas, and those, of course, get converted into new businesses, new services, and new products, and that's absolutely required to build, the massive economies that we built. So, and you can say this for individual companies, and you can say this even just for individuals, right? If I want to learn more and grow as an individual, the more variation that I allow in, different ideas and different challenges and things that I need to adapt to, the better I'm going to grow as an individual. So access means growth. Open things up. Of course, there's a dosage to that. It doesn't mean just completely open everything. At some point that could become toxic and poison the growth process, right? Unrelenting growth that can't be backfilled by the ability to sustain it, as we talked about in the WeWork example, right? Is not good. But generally speaking, you want to open things and you want to allow that variation to take place. So variation, as I'm calling it, which is really just more public access, getting into those books, reading those books, giving feedback, being part of that growth process, that's very much what led to the growth of literature and books and libraries in general. But let's go back to some of that incentive, right? So as you look through, and they talked about this all in the book, The Library of Fragile History, going through these different phases. So you started with the monasteries, and then you kind of got universities, and you got the bigger churches getting interested in storing. And eventually you had these Renaissance book hunters who would travel to the monasteries and acquired as many books as they could. And so what this was is kind of this merchant push to get into book trading and getting to book selling. They realized that books were becoming very popular. Now I kind of skipped over a lot of history here. Obviously we went from manuscripts to books, right? So there's this whole history of going from basically the skins of calves, right, to actual paper technology, going from these scripts that were rolled to books that were bound, and you could hold a lot of information. So there's that whole history, and I'm not going to go over all that, but you've got that. But as books became, a way to store information, and they became much more transportable, and we'll get obviously into the printing press, conversation a little bit later. But you had these Renaissance book hunters who would travel to the monasteries and try to get as many books as they could. Maybe some of these were manuscripts as well, but and they were kind of hostile because they had this profit motive, and they wanted to sell these books. They wanted to trade these books. They wanted to build their own business, right? But despite the book hunters' motive, we owe much of the growth of the library to these Renaissance book hunters. And this is going to be a common theme throughout this episode, where the growth of the library, again, doesn't have a lot to do with necessarily trying to proliferate information for the sake of information, or making sure that the public has access to good knowledge. And not to say that people involved didn't have some of those motives, but a lot of it was either a profit motive or a political, economic motive going forward. So you had these Renaissance book hunters who were, taking a lot of the information out of monasteries. And part of the history here is the monasteries starting to fall to the wayside. Their importance in society were kind of being replaced. Again, you've got universities popping up as centers of education, and of course you've got more secular movements that move away to some extent from the non-secular religious movements of the day, but of course they're always going back and forth and in play with each other. You've got the humanists eventually moving in and being interested in information for reasons other than religion, and on. And so you've got this kind of mercantilism happening, or these merchants rather, trading books and doing things for profit motives as the demand gets higher, and as the demand is there for reasons other than religion. And then you have technology. So obviously, the Gutenberg printing press invented in 1440. And so I'll just give you some example of, technology and its reach. So without the printing press, it would take a scribe about 1 year to produce 2 substantial folio manuscripts. Okay. So think about just, basically a script, right? And you've got to write it out. And if you wanted to get 2 substantial ones, a decent amount of writing, it would take you about a year to produce 2. With the printing press, the company could produce 1,000 copies of the same work in about 8 to 10 months. Okay, so, and of course, this is nothing compared to what we can do today, but showing that now that technology comes into play, the movable printing press, you basically can have ink on these kind of molds, or these solid objects that hold each letter rate of the language, and you can switch them around. And once you have what's written, it's still a very slow process compared to something like the digital revolution, but you can create many, many pages of the same text, and you can replicate that. So technology. So now we take information, which again has already this kind of baked in reach to it, right? If you speak the same language and you can understand written text, and you can copy that text that already has this immense power to it, now you couple that with a technology that allows you to replicate that going forward, and things start to go to a very large scale. So replication and scale is kind of baked into information in general, right? Because we've got technologies like the printing press, and then we know as we get into the internet and the digital age that it's still about replication and scale, but just hypercharged to a whole different level. But of course, there's a cost to scale. So all progress comes with consequences, right? So 30 copies of the Gutenberg Bible printed on parchment required the skins of at least 5,000 calves. Okay, so 30 copies of the Bible that when it was printed on parchment required the skins of 5,000 calves. Okay. Also, information instantly becomes ubiquitous. So you think, well, that's a great thing. There's information everywhere. But of course, there's a cost to that. And we could debate whether that's positive, negative, or maybe sometimes neutral, rarely neutral. But if everyone has access to that information, politically, you might think, well, maybe we're losing some control over things, right? And we want people to believe certain things. And so there's going to be a cost to not allowing the information because there's going to be this back pressure from the public who wants access to it. But there's going to be a cost to allowing people to think and believe whatever they want, right? And of course, not everybody thinks that's a cost, but there's always, good things and bad things to everything that you do. So information instantly becoming ubiquitous because of technologies that allow this new reach and scale to happen, calls new things into question, and it forces society to start to consider, what all this means, right? And so often when we talk about technology and what it means, often what we're really saying is the information that's being freed with that technology, right? And people now have access to things that they didn't have access to before, and they can make different types of decisions. And at the extreme end of things, we can think that's a wonderful thing. The other extreme, we can think that's an awful thing. And then somewhere in the middle is maybe there's a balance, right? So there are political, economical, and religious consequences that come with the massive replication of information. And so because of that, limiting access to undesirable literature starts to play a very big role throughout history, right? So we've got this term expurgating texts. And so expurgating texts to basically limit the access to literature through censorship. And this is still alive and well today, right? This is always a part of the information conversation. And when you have technologies that scale things at a massive level, it becomes even more and more of an issue. And that's sometimes for religious reasons and sometimes for other reasons. But, throughout history, the Protestant Reformation would be a good example where we saw the battle between the Protestants and the Catholics, and both sides were interested in burning the works of others, right? Because they were saying some of the same things, but many different things, and they had different interpretation of obviously what was written in the Bible and what that means and what you should be allowed to and not allowed to do. And so as religion gets tied up with the politics and the control and the power, the burning of books was a common thing. It could be raiding of monasteries or raiding of libraries when certain areas were taken over, and burning the works or possibly taking it for yourself, and either hiding them away or doing whatever. But massive amounts of information was lost all throughout history. And so very much throughout this entire book, when they're talking about libraries, you've got these big, beautiful libraries get built and then they would get destroyed, or, the countries would go to war and the victors would either confiscate all the books or they would burn all the books. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is something that is very much alive and well today, and usually not always in the form of books, although there are some recent examples, right, of libraries burning. I mean, there's one in LA not too long ago, where you still lose a lot of information. Of course, losing is not quite the same thing as it is today because we can digitally replicate things at will. But the censorship aspect absolutely is a major topic that comes up again and again, right? Who is allowed to say what? Different countries have different uses of the internet. China uses the internet very differently than we do, at least in terms of access and what they can Google. They kind of have their own version. But over time, there's always this great regret in society for the burnishing or banishing of books, right? Because the current political climate may suggest that certain censorship is valid, but hundreds of years from now, the landscape will change politically, right? And socially and economically. And so, hundreds of years from now, will it make sense? If we take today and we look back in time, I don't think really anybody says, oh, I'm glad we burned all those books, right? We usually regret it, even if it was, really bad thinking or things that led, just from a historical perspective, it's good to know what the thought was. I mean, especially if you want to learn from history, you may sometimes want to repeat things. You might not want to repeat others. Either way, it's generally thought that, historically, we should have access to the information that was from the past so we can see what was being written about at the time. I mean, how else can we understand, the evolution of humanity? So, fast forward to today or any current time, when we start to limit access to information through censorship, there is something problematic about that, right? Because, we don't want to. We know that political climates can change and the landscape can change, and we should be able to have access to things in the past. But again, there's a cost to everything, right? What does that mean to allow access? But yeah, different countries take different stances on this, and whenever information and power come together, there's this notion of what should be and should not be allowed. And of course, you've got different countries wanting to do this for reasons of promoting their own version of things, right? Obviously, the U.S. has a history of not wanting too much, communist type language coming in, and then vice versa, right? You wouldn't want too much capitalist type language coming into a communist country, and so there's either a limiting or there's an all-out banning or burning. And I'll get to this in a bit, but I talked about banning of technologies in previous episodes, right? And how that just ultimately doesn't make sense because of this kind of property of simultaneous invention. Like, things are always going to reappear. They're always going to come back. There's nothing that has to happen at a certain point in history from an informational standpoint that can't then happen again. That doesn't make any sense. There's too much variation. There's too much possibility for discovery. It's always going to come back again. So the banning is always going to be a temporary thing anyway, in terms of, it is going to get rediscovered. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, how I don't think there's anything, lost information actually doesn't really make sense, although, it can be problematic to censor at a given point in time. So let's continue with that conversation as we get into things. But from the ashes, so the libraries just have this absolute, kind of perilous journey of, you've got these people who invest, you've got, rich people who try to build a library and build information for whatever their motives are. And then, things could just either not be popular because of political pressure or because the books are being locked up, or, the books are being burned, or whatever it is. And the library just has this up and down, up and down. In the mid-16th century, libraries got a resurgence after so much was destroyed from the Protestant Reformation. This resurgence came from Europe's rising class of professionals who eagerly embraced the opportunity for book ownership. Okay, so now we talk about some of these incentives, right? You got political incentives, you got profit motives. Ownership is another big one. Okay, this idea that, maybe it makes sense to have my own library, right? Forget, the government or whoever. Just rich people, let's say, putting together their own, storehouses of information. I kind of want to own the information. I want to own the book. And that's really interesting. That's a different take on things. And of course, that's a big conversation in and of itself, right? The US in general, as an example, or the West world the Western side of things have been big on ownership as being kind of a core value, right? Right up there with, freedoms and freedom of speech and all that good stuff. So ownership is another incentive. Now, again, this isn't necessarily the same as, just wanting access to information. There's something about owning the information. There's something about displaying the information. If you come, I'm a doctor and you come into my house, I want you to see a wall of books behind me, regardless of whether I have read them or not. But there are personal collections throughout history for lawyers, civil servants, doctors, professors, and ministers of the church who ultimately created the new book market. Okay, so this book market comes from people not just wanting access to the information, but they want to be able to own that information. And so there's kind of this is a little bit less about the public library as we think about the library today, and more about the personal library. But you need a book market. You need the back pressure you need the demand of people wanting to read and wanting to have books. Okay. So part of the resurgence of the interest in reading and books in general comes from these professionals who wanted to own their own, which is also kind of interesting. And so we take a look at these, this history of the library where things are falling down and then things kind of resurge. You have this resurgence going on. And like so many, I put this graph in almost every talk just because it's a very common pattern. I'm obviously generalizing here, but there's this idea that things kind of grow a little bit slowly, right? And all of a sudden you hit this reflection point and it takes off. And there's a number of reasons for this. And in the case of, books and information in general, you've got, everything from the evolution maybe of politics that think about information slightly differently, to technologies that allow the massive replication to happen, to a public that gets interested in things like ownership and the use of information for its utility in their profession. You've kind of got this critical storm, right? That has to happen, like a critical mass, where all these factors come together, and then all of a sudden it hits an inflection point, and then things just absolutely take off. And you've got the technology, you've got the demand, you've got the type of thinking, you've got the awareness, you've got the political landscape, whatever it is. And as an example, that kind of proves this point is more books have been created in the last 100 years than in the whole history of mankind. So in the last 100 years, more books have been created than the whole history of mankind, right? And obviously technology is playing a big role, but again, all those other factors that I mentioned. And this growth inflection, this critical point, and self-sufficiency that happens is true for any kind of thing that has the potential to grow. I mean, if it reaches a critical mass, this will take off, right? This will happen in your own life. This will happen in companies, right? You get enough employees, you get enough market demand, you get enough, product features put into your product, whatever it is. Eventually enough comes together and then it becomes self-sufficient, and it, kind of has this feedback loop, and then it just takes off. This can happen for problematic things, as we've talked about. I've talked about in other episodes, right? Where, we think that something is necessarily not that bad because we're just doing little incremental things, and all of a sudden enough bad things come together, you hit that critical mass, and then it takes off on its own, and nobody's at the helm. And so many things in life are like this, where we lose the ability to point the finger at anything because it just takes off on its own. And that could be a good, right? It could be a positive outcome, it could be negative outcomes. The point is that you have to respect that this is how growth happens, right? You reach that critical point, and it's not obvious when that critical point is going to happen. It's definitely not obvious what the components need to be to make that criticality occur in real world systems like this, but it is a common pattern. It is a common property. So the library saw this when enough pieces of information and information technology, quote unquote, came together to make that happen. So more books in the last 100 years than all of human history. So it's kind of neat. The world wars, we talk about book banning and censorship and expurgation of texts. I mean, the world wars just kind of hypercharged all that, right? This notion that you haven't won unless you've erased your enemy from history, right? So if you think about the library, if your enemy has their library and it's their beacon of civilization, right? This is us. This is our information. Look how civilized we are. And obviously the library is going to be stocked with books, especially around, the times of World War I and II, that are kind of tailored, right, to what the government wants you to be reading in the first place. So it's not just a beacon of your own civilization. It's the type of civilization that you're trying to build. It's a reflection of that. It's either filled with a lot of, communist literature or maybe capitalist literature or whatever it is, right? So if your enemy has storehouses of that types of information, then you kind of want to, in war, wipe that out, right? You want to destroy that. So some interesting stats here. Russia alone lost 100 million books to the war, right? England lost 60 million. France lost 20 million, and Poland 2/3 of its entire book stock. So these are just massive amounts of quote unquote information lost, although we'll debate that, right, a little bit later. But, still at the time, tons of information lost, books lost. Really tragic no matter how you look at it, even though, again, I'll talk about some of the recoverability later. But and all because of what information represents, right? I mean, think about what that's always such an interesting thing, because information is ephemeral, right? You can't touch it. There's something kind of always unreal. It's unphysical, right? It's this ephemeral thing that you can't quite put your finger on. What is information? And yet it's the most valuable thing by far. And I think that's been true all throughout history, because even in the Industrial Revolution, even when things that were very, machine related, cogs and pistons, very physical, and you think, well, that's where the efficiency and that's where the scalability comes from. But it takes information, it takes ideas, it takes iteration, it takes collaboration to do all those things. So information is really what it's all about. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Politically, economically, religiously, it all comes down to information. People's opportunity comes down to information, your ability to make something out of your own life, and on, right? So when you see this massive destruction of information during war, it kind of goes to show what the real value is, right? People get that that's what it's about, right? So in war, you see this effort to erase the enemy from history, to erase their testaments to knowledge and civilization. And it isn't all book burning. So you got like this carpet bombing, and you got the burning that obviously destroys a lot of information. Some of it is actually, and the Nazis did a lot of this, was taking books from other countries and bringing it back to their own country, doing whatever. And so you've kind of got this almost reconciliation that has to happen years later, where all these books have to get returned, but they don't always know who owns them, and it's just this big mess. And the book kind of talks about this just disaster trying to like post-war get books back to where they belong, where tens of millions, and it's just a nightmare. And sometimes you just have to say you can't do it. And so anyway, yeah, pretty interesting stuff. But the value of information is obviously huge, right? Again, everything that I'm saying in this episode, think about present day, right? I mean, talking about some of the history here. We're talking about monasteries and scripts and printing presses and politics and war, but all of that is so relevant to the value of information, right? Censorship, the library, which kind of in some sense seems a bit antiquated, right? When we think of the library, right? Especially in the age of the internet. But what the library represents, which is a physical version of the value of information, is just such a hallmark of, well, just that, the value of information, what that means in terms of control and access and opportunity and all the things that are still so relevant today, right? But and the book talks about, so you've got all this happening with libraries, right? And you've got, the wars and the censorship and the banning and the expurgation all throughout history. And at some point, the world just kind of stops and says, look, are we so civilized, right? I mean, if you think about the library as being this kind of monument to supposed civilization, right? Like, look at our knowledge, look at what we have achieved. I mean, how do you put all that in one place? How do you point at something and say, look what we've achieved, this is civilization? Well, the library is kind of that, right? And it has been throughout history. And even the internet can't do that, because you can't point at the internet, right? Because it's so distributed. And again, information is so ephemeral. So the more informational you get about something, the less you can put your finger on it. So the library is kind of the only, to this day, the only way to really point your finger at something like civilization, at something like knowledge, at something like progress, right? How do you, because everything ultimately comes down to information. So how do you put all that in one spot and say, look? And that's why you have the emphasis on beautiful architecture with libraries, because you want a way to point at something and say, look how amazing that is, right? It's kind of analogous to some of the cathedral type churches, I guess, right? Because religion, you could say the faith in a god is ultimately ephemeral, because you can't actually see the god. So how do you point to something physical and say, look, right? Look what it is that we believe, right? Look at the power. You do that physically. And so just like you would do with cathedrals, you do that with libraries, right? And that's why a lot of the libraries throughout history, there was an age, especially from Andrew Carnegie, where libraries kind of got boring and utilitarian looking. But for most of history, libraries have been architectural spectacles, right? Because it's the way to point your finger at something informational and yet so powerful. So, but there's this question, right? So you're pointing at civilization, and then you're saying, yeah, but we keep destroying them, right? Why do we keep destroying these storehouses of these hallmarks of civilization? As a human race, right? We understand that people go to war, and that we get why we're banning and burning and carpet bombing and censoring. It's not, nobody generally thinks that's a great thing, but we understand why that happens. But it makes you step back and say, well, are we so civilized? And that's a good way to kind of physically anchor that conversation. If you wanted to get into a debate about, the so-called civilization that we create, if that was true, why do we keep tearing down the hallmarks of civilization, right? Are we so civilized? But now I want to talk about this notion that progress often doesn't look like progress. So in line with what I just said, burning down, obstacles are often the ways forward, right? The conditions of war, as an example, if we use war as a perfect example of just, are we so civilized? It actually turned many millions into avid readers. And there's a number of reasons for this, everything from, so many men going to war that put a lot of women into libraries, and women had this massive influence over how the libraries would be, structured and organized and run. And so women play a very big role in history of the growth of the library. So there's that whole great story. There's the bringing books to the men in war, so that when they weren't actually fighting, they had something to do. Obviously, a lot of this was before, for much of history, before anything like smartphones or internet or televisions to watch. So there needed to be some form of entertainment. Fiction starts to play a bigger and bigger role, where it's not just about, access to non-fictional information, right? Where you can reference, how the world works or what you should believe and all that. There's this big fiction, stories of adventure and romance that starts to come up. So conditions like war actually turn many into avid readers, and there'll be other reasons as well, right? I mean, war starts to rip away certain opportunities because of the atrocities or whatever is going on. And so to get more opportunity, you typically need access to information, and so on and on. There's all these reasons that the obstacle becomes the way forward in a lot of ways, right? So there is a quote unquote upside to the frequent destruction of libraries. It's forcing them to constantly reinvent themselves. Okay. From turmoil comes progress. And again, this is not really just about libraries, is it? This is about life. This is about anything that you are creating. You should be destroying most of what you create should be destroyed on a regular basis, right? Now, hopefully that's not because of things like war and stuff, but just as a general process, if you really want to know if somebody's going to make a difference in the world, you should get them to show you the 80 or 90% of the things that are failing on a regular basis. Don't ask them, what's working and what's successful, although that's a good conversation too. I mean, ask them what isn't working, right? Because if 80% of the stuff that you do is not failing, then you're not doing enough. It's like a simple heuristic, right? Because that failure is baked into the process of growth. And the reason is because, and again, remember that image from, I used 2 times now in a few episodes, the wrong structure to the right structure, right? You got to be putting things forward. It has to break. Its break is the only way to coax out information. It's a way of dealing with the epistemic uncertainty, right? To get past that causal opacity that's in our environment, you have to constantly be doing wrong things, right? Not sitting back on a whiteboard and trying to draw up some great design. You need to just keep putting things in and seeing what survives. It's the only way to access the information you need to build the right stuff. So the constant reinvention of the library, these hallmarks of civilization, these storehouses of information, has been critical to its progress. Okay, as bad, So when you think about things like expurgation of text, and you think about the carpet bombing of libraries and the burning them down, and like, why can't we just get civilization to work? Well, civilization probably does work because of those things, right? As well as it does. Not that it's perfect, but whatever does work in civilization is because so much of it has not worked, right? We have to remember that. It's not just, civilization cannot just be some singular idea, that comes from ancient philosophers that just needs to get implemented correctly. It's something that constantly evolves and adapts. And so to get there, you've got to have a lot of destruction. And that's true of anything that grows. So we talked about the critical mass, the criticality that's needed for growth processes. Part of that is constant destruction and reinvention. Okay, evolution, of course, happens like this. Most species die. Most versions of things that nature creates don't work. And that's how nature finds and discovers what does work. So, other interesting things. You think about the resiliency of the library. It's still here. It's still moving. It's still growing all throughout history. An obvious question is you think of the new forms of media like radio. When radio came along, that was obviously a challenge to something like the library, because the radio could be just listened to, and you could add layers that the book doesn't have directly. We could bring sound effects in. We could do different voices. I don't have to do all of that in my own head just from reading text. Like you could really bring a lot of that into the media, and of course television just totally supercharges that, where you can create an entire 3-dimensional experience, however you want to think about that, with the sound and the actors, and especially when the sound came into television. But it didn't supplant the library. And a lot of that was because of crossover opportunities. So the fodder for the radio and the television would be books, right? Books would be dramatized into radio and television, right? You have to feed it somehow. And so this is the interesting thing about information, right? The technology is not really what it's about. It's not about the television. It's not about the radio. It's not even about the book. It's about the information, the thing you can't touch. Okay. And that's why books are still so popular today, because information doesn't go away, and books is one way to put down the information onto paper, which could then cross over into things like radio and television and movies. You think Harry Potter, right? Movies have made just billions and billions of dollars, made the author billions, $1 billion, and she wrote books, right? That's where it all came from. She was not a movie maker. She wasn't specializing in radio. All the technology that replicated and scaled and grew the story of something like Harry Potter came from a set of books. So books are still insanely relevant because they feed into the informational paradigm, and there's all these crossover opportunities. And so that's something to always think about, in your own life as well. And anytime you're trying to build or grow something, you have this kind of beautiful redundancy that exists between systems. And I think a good way to think about this is actually transferable skills. So you've got, if you're one of those people where, you're a little bit older, and so people are always asking you questions, and maybe you have some success in your life, so they're asking you questions about, getting jobs and growing your career, and how do you do all this? And, one of the major things you can do, and you hear this all the time, but I don't think a lot of people really understand it. One of the things you can do, so let's say you're going to go get a job, or you're going to go apply for a job, and it's the interview, and people tend to focus on, exactly what the job description said. And they always talk like, well, I don't know if I really have those skills, and I don't have all that experience. And sometimes they might not even go to the job interview because of that, or they won't be confident on the job interview because of that. And I keep telling people, look, it's not about having those specific skills. It's really about having transferable skills. And some people will say, they kind of hear that as a cliche and be like, yeah, I know, I've heard that before. We're supposed to have transferable skills. Yeah, but stop and think about that. I mean, what that means is no matter what your experience is, it bears strong relationship to the specific skills that they're looking for. And you have to become good at understanding what those crossover opportunities are, right? So if you're going for a job, and maybe it's in, I don't know, maybe it's in product development, maybe it's for software, there's product development, there's programming languages, and there's different technologies you need to know, and there's team dynamics that you're going to be working on, and tools that you're going to be working with, intermixed with those team dynamics and facilitating those dynamics. And you might be reading that job description, well, I haven't used that tool, or maybe I don't know that programming language that much, or maybe, look, you have all kinds of, you have this rich life experience that has these strong overlaps to solving problems in a similar fashion to, maybe you're not using that exact tool, but you've used tools before, and here's how you use it to solve a problem. And here's how it relates to what you're looking for. And that's the reality of it. In fact, it can be even more beneficial than getting someone with a direct experience, because it's not about the specific, tangible, physical thing that you're using. And anybody who runs a successful business knows this is true, right? What you're hiring someone into, because you can always train people on tools, you can always train them on programming languages. What you're looking for is something more intangible than that. What you're looking for is that ability to take what's around you, to solve problems with it, to communicate them effectively, right? To master a new tool when that tool comes into your realm, right? To bring that into your own knowledge base, and on and on. And so what you're trying to communicate on a job interview is your ability to do that. And you should be saying that confidently, because that's how information works. Just as the book can be written, but ultimately becomes so much more than the book itself, because there's that's the way information works. It intermixes with different physical manifestations of the information. You know what I mean when I say that? So what I mean by that is, Harry Potter is not about the book Harry Potter, or the radio, the Harry Potter, or the television series, if that becomes a thing, or if it is a thing. Or the movies that get created. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the physical ultimate manifestation of the thing is. What it's all about is the information that was laid down on paper. Okay, so what your skill sets are is your ability to, I use tools, and I do solve problems, and I do communicate them, and here's how I do it. And if anything, it's a benefit that I've done it in a different domain than what you're hiring for, because now I can bring that outside domain knowledge and look at what you're doing more objectively, and add to the variation of your team and help you blah, 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 blah. Okay, so it's about the information. So when people say things like, you got to get good about talking about your transferable skills, you should get really, really, really good at that. It's absolutely critical, and people who are hiring understand that. Okay, you see, this was a talk about libraries, and we're talking about all this other stuff. Isn't that great? See, these are fundamental patterns, right, in life. So transferable skills, and it's not just getting jobs. I mean, this is true of all areas in life, right? Again, I talk about how there's only so many patterns in life, right? But it can take a lifetime to learn them. Well, that's what, that convergence that I talk about, the way information comes together and converges. That's because the information doesn't have borders, right? It doesn't have barriers, right? I mean, people might impose them, but information itself doesn't. So information doesn't care if it's on a book, if it's in a radio, it's in a television. It doesn't care if it's in this country, or that country. It doesn't care if it's expressed through this tool or this tool or this tool, right? It doesn't matter if you play music on this instrument, or this instrument. It's not about the instrument. It's not about the book. It's not about the television. It's not about the country. It's not about the border. It's about the information. It's fluid. It moves in and out. And when you really understand that, it's very, very empowering. Because in one sense, things become quite easy. Because you realize there's only a few things that I really need to understand here. And as long as I keep converging all this different types of information on those same few things, right? That anchor, that pattern, or those few patterns, then there's nothing you can't do. And it's true. And I'm not saying that to be motivational. I mean, there's nothing you can't do by definition, because it's not about those different manifestations of the thing. I want to apply to that job. Yeah, so apply and talk about your transferable skills. Yeah, but I haven't done that exact thing. Yeah, I know. Doesn't matter, because it's not about that thing. It's not about those tools. It's not about that software. It's not about that program. It's not about anything specific. It's about the ephemeral. It's about the things that there are no words for. It's those informational patterns that you need to be good at, not the specifics. I talk about details being meant to die. This is all the same thing, all the same patterns, right? Details are meant to die. A job description is just a set of details. They don't matter. They don't matter. Okay? They're getting spoken about. This is why younger people get intimidated, because they're spoken about as if they matter. Like, well, we expect you to have it. Yeah. Whatever. I mean, because people need to say something. Again, there are no words for what really matters, so they got to use words, and so the words are specific, and so you think the specifics matters, but they don't. It's the things that there are no words for that matter. So you have to understand that. You have to understand the patterns that are important, not the specifics that are important. Anyway, so crossover opportunities and so that's why, the library, going back finally to the library conversation, is so critical, is so important, or why it grew and why it's so successful, because information doesn't die. Can't kill information, right? So it's going to have different physical manifestations. Anyway, so these crossover opportunities all come. People in sales and marketing probably know this from things like multi-channel stuff, right? Like omni-channel and all this, where you can do different versions of the thing, right? You only have one thing, but you can manifest it in many different ways. If you really understand information and core patterns and crossover, you get this. So anyway, all good stuff. So yeah, there's this exceptional resiliency to libraries, to information in general. You could say it's kind of the books, maybe scripts even, are the original information technology, right? And so they get manifested in different ways, and because they can live in so many different forms, is another way of thinking how something doesn't die, right? It's related to redundancy, right? Remember I talked about the circulatory kind of the system of the heart. If you look at certain pictures of this, I think I put that picture on one of my episodes, right? And it's got all this crazy redundancy. It's like, why don't you just have one path? Well, because one path is really dangerous. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to have that diversification. You want to have that beautiful redundancy. So here's the thing. I think this is important. Okay, I know this is important. To truly understand the power of something, the reason why fundamental foundational things are so critical to know is because they become universal. Okay, there's this universality to them. Okay, because they. So if you take a specific detailed version of something, it can only exist in that one manifestation, right? Like that job description, or like this particular tool, anything, it doesn't matter. If you have a specific detailed description of something, it has no universality to it, because details cannot be universal, because it's a very specific implementation of something. But the more you generalize something, right, the more foundational it is, the more it can live in many different versions of things, right? So physically, whether that's the iPad and the iPhone and the computer and all these different, right, whatever it is. So resiliency comes from something that has this universality aspect to it, because it doesn't matter if things get destroyed. It's going to come back again, because it can come back in so many different forms. That's what universality means. The ability to come back in so many different forms. The ability to mix and match. I talked about this last episode with respect to language, right? So the things that you focus on it should never matter what their physical manifestation is. That's a good way. That's a simple heuristic. If what you do requires a very specific implementation of something, it's going to be fragile. It's going to die very easy. But if what you do doesn't really matter what job it's found in, it doesn't matter what tool it's found in, it doesn't matter what customer base it needs, the less specific what you believe in and what you do requires, the less specificity it requires, the more resilient it's going to be, because it can find many different paths, right? Ultimately, this is a kind of computational argument, right? And a very true one. It's just it shouldn't even call it an argument. It's just a truth, right? It's a fundamental truth. So again, it's not about the specifics. It's not about the thing that you can touch and feel. It's about the ultimate ephemeral truth of something, because it will be able to reinvent itself and live in so many different things. So anyway, the resilience of the library and of the book, we see this. So the library has survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, the media change from manuscript to print, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, carpet bombing, countless attempts to limit access to unacceptable texts, quote unquote unacceptable texts. And it keeps coming back, and it keeps coming back, and it keeps coming back, because information is so foundational. The need for information is foundational. It's never going to go away. There's no physical thing you can do to stop information from happening. It will find a different path, right? Information will find a way, right? Just like life finds a way. Books, the library, it survived the inventions that were supposed to spell its end, right? Microfilm, CD-ROM, e-readers, the internet, of course, right? I mean, we have the internet. We have access to just about any information we can imagine, especially in North America. I mean, there's nothing we can't access. And yet, we still got libraries. We still have libraries. We still have people reading physical books, right? I always do the physical book for my podcast. So, I want to talk about unrelated targets now. It's because we talked about a lot of the different incentives for the library, right? So we've got information, we've got the importance of it, we've got these beacons of civilization, all the good things that we think of with regards to information. But why was it done? Well, libraries and literature took off largely because of merchants in business that were flourishing. People wanted to sell books and trade books. They wanted to make money off it. We've got people showing off books. A lot of people buy books. I'll talk about this in a second, just because they want to show them off, right? I mean, how many people who have these walls of books have even read the books on it, right? They've got these walls of books, and you kind of wonder, have you read those? Growth in important things is caused by unrelated targets. So I talk about this all the time, right? Goals are not supposed to be met. You have to have them, but they're not supposed to be met. If you met your goal, you kind of failed, actually, because the goal is supposed to, your reach is supposed to exceed the grasp. But anything good, the useful stuff, comes as a byproduct of trying to achieve something unrelated. So the libraries were done for ostentatious purposes, right? They're done to show elitism, to show intellectualism, to show civilization, not because they're trying to promote necessarily literature for the sake of literature, or to get more people to read, or wouldn't it be great if people had education? No, these were not the motives of the library. And yet, that's very much the byproduct of things like the library, right? Only afterwards did things like universities pick up on the importance of reading. That wasn't even the reason they started doing it, right? They wanted to show the force, show the elitism, show the intellectualism. So it makes me think of questions, when people bring, but in fact, this is happening right now. So if you go on Twitter right now, it's kind of crazy, right? I mean, Elon Musk just bought Twitter. And so this whole kind of freedom of speech talk going on. It's kind of fun on Twitter right now, actually. So I'm not taking a side on this on my podcast, but because that's not the purpose of this episode. But there's always this ongoing question, like, should Elon Musk be focusing on more important things? And this was happening before he bought Twitter, right? Because he's, world's richest man, and he's got obviously billions of dollars. And if you look at what he's working on, it's things like, let's get rockets into space, and let's try to land people on Mars. Let's build electric cars, and let's, a lot of this kind of futuristic stuff. And so it's easy to look at things like that and say, well, if you've got all this money, we've got people in poverty, and we've got, people starving on the planet, wouldn't it make sense to throw your money at more good things or something like that? But I think that's a very short-sighted way of thinking about it, right? And there's a whole kind of talk here we could get into about, throwing money at things does not really solve the problems, right? Because you need to create a system that is self-sustaining. If you enable somebody or a bunch of people by throwing money at them, you might have a quick fix, but that's not going to fix the problem, because the solution has to come from some organic growth of a system that can support itself, right? So money can't do that. It has to be something that grows over time. But aside from all that conversation, right, we don't know what sending rockets into space is going to accomplish, right? We don't know what's going to, the internet didn't come because people were focusing on the internet. They're working at CERN and they're doing something completely unrelated, and all of a sudden the internet popped out. And again, this is true of almost anything that's useful. The target does not have to be, people who focus on, well, here, I think on my next, so I've got this tweet that I did before, where I said almost all of science owes its progress to trade, commerce, and profit. And that's true, whether you like it or not. Almost all of science owes its progress to trade, commerce, and profit. Okay, because that is what made people go out and try to create things and try to build things and coax all kinds of information out of the environment. And out of that came, new theories about how things worked and models that came up. Again, it's not really science laying a foundation, then people go engineer things from science. I'm sorry, that just pretty much never happens. That's such a false narrative. It's people going and tinkering and messing around and trying to invent things and having motives like profit and trade and elitism and intellectual things and things that aren't on their surface really that great. But because for whatever reason that motivates the human to go forward and partake in society, you have all these things that come off as a byproduct of that. And so when you ask those kind of Elon Musky type questions, right, where you've got this really rich dude and he's got all this money, why doesn't he just throw it at obvious problems? And I think that we have to realize that that's just not how things work. It's not good. It doesn't really make sense to pick a target directly and work at it, because the solution to the problem is going to come as a byproduct of being focused on something different, right? If the trade and the commerce gets you partaking in the environment to try to create something for whatever your reason happens to be, there's going to be all this kind of offshooting technology and ideas and solutions that come out of that, which can then get repurposed to more useful outcomes. And that's just the true history. That is what we see. And if you understand complexity in systems, that really should not surprise you. So that indirect target, I just keep bringing up, right? It's a very important pattern. Now, I want to talk about this opinion that I have, which is that there's no such thing as lost knowledge. And this gets into simultaneous invention. So I talked about simultaneous invention in a previous episode with respect to we're talking about technology, right? Technology is humanity. We talked about banning, and it doesn't make any sense to ban because eventually that discovery is going to come up again. Okay, I talk about you don't need Einstein for relativity, right? You don't. Sorry, it definitely would have been discovered. It's ridiculous to suggest otherwise, and that's true of any kind of theory. So we have all this burning of books, and I'm not saying it's not tragic at all, of course, right? But the idea that you're going to there's this kind of romantic notion that there's lost civilizations, right? there's civilizations that have been lost, and who knows what knowledge they had. I'm sorry. Whatever knowledge they had, either we've rediscovered it, which is probably 99.999% true, and if we haven't, it's going to be discovered. Okay, now that doesn't mean there's no tragedy there, but this romantic idea that who knows what information these civilizations had in the past, it just doesn't line up to what we know about discovery, about creativity, about simultaneous invention. It's going to happen statistically, right? The way information works, the way it can manifest itself in so many different ways means that it's going to get discovered. No individual mind or even civilization or culture really owns a set of ideas. And I know that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, but I'm sorry, that's just patently obvious if you look at the way systems work. So simultaneous invention, this idea that it doesn't only occur in one place. Any invention, any theory, any idea, anything from any culture anywhere is going to occur somewhere else. It might look a little bit different, right? And that might be a true loss, right? Because the way something is manifested can be beautiful from a cultural perspective. Like this culture came up with this particular idea in this way, and isn't that neat and isn't that great? 100%. Yeah, totally agree. But the idea that the idea itself or the technology itself or whatever itself could not have come from any other individual or culture, that is just not true. So even though, and I think there's a positive thing about that, because when we think about all these libraries and these books being lost, hundreds of millions of books being lost, it's got an aspect of tragedy to it, but as a human civilization, I guarantee you we've recovered almost all that knowledge. And even if we haven't, it's going to come anyways in one form or another. And again, it might not be in the exact same form. And maybe there's a bit of a tragedy to that if you really like the form of something, right? Because you think that's interesting. But the information itself is going to get rediscovered. So I don't believe there's a such thing as lost knowledge. And this kind of goes back to that pattern of convergence, right? I don't think there's that many things to know, right? It's actually, through time, we just learn the same few things again and again. They manifest in different ways. So again, if Einstein had died before 1921, whatever, we would have absolutely had relativity, right? Wouldn't have looked exactly the same. The formulation might have been a little bit different, but we definitely would have it. We didn't need Henry Ford for the assembly line. We didn't need, take your example, right? So I don't think there's such thing as lost knowledge. And I think there's a positive aspect to that because, it means despite, so going back to that question, which I had, are we so civilized, right? Again, you need that destruction, you need that rediscovery, you need that reinvention. And even when things are completely destroyed, we know that they come back in one form or another. So no such thing as lost knowledge. Rediscovery is inevitable. And I had a tweet on this recently. I said, there is no such thing as lost or forgotten knowledge. There are no ancient civilizations with yet to be discovered insights. Such romantic notions are precluded by simultaneous invention. The all too obvious fact that every possible discovery is guaranteed to happen somewhere. As long as it's possible, it's going to happen again. So that's a good thing. That's hope, right? You must destroy to create, right? The library. So the title of this book is The Library, A Fragile History, but in a way it's a very not fragile history, right? If it was so fragile, it wouldn't be here still. So the quote unquote fragile history of the library shows countless incidents where libraries and their books were destroyed, but this is a required aspect of any type of growth where things must be killed off and reinvented, right? So the library's fragile past was not so fragile, since adaptability comes from regular destruction. That's where the adaptability comes from, right? Humans are so, because we like narrative, we think in these linear fashion. We think that something kind of gets like designed up front, and then that's what was good. So you either had a good design or you didn't, right? It's just not how it works, right? It doesn't. The thing doesn't matter. It's the process that matters. And the library has gone through this process of constant reinvention. And that's why it's here today. It's very, it's not about being fragile. It's very, anti-fragile, to borrow Taleb's term, right? It's part of survivability. It's part of adaptability. It's part of resilience. Whatever it is you do should constantly be destroyed and reinvented. That's a sign of survivability, right? So the breakable past of the library is what allowed it to take foothold and grow, right? And again, that goes back to the fact that what the library really represents is information, and information cannot be killed. Information can find many different ways to manifest itself. So you can keep killing it and keep killing it. And again, it's not just that it survives, it's that every time you break it, it learns, right? It being the library or the people that are putting together the library, whatever, however you want to think about that. That's how you coax the information out of the environment to figure out what something needs to be in order to continue to grow. So I kind of I talk about this indirect targets, right? So much of the history of collecting books had to do with showing them off rather than reading. Okay, and there's so many different ways of thinking about that. We go back to the Elon Musk question about what should he be throwing his money at. We talk about the profit motive and political motive and all these different motives for the growth of the library. It was about the ostentatious behavior and the portrayal of elitism and intellectualism that books portrayed that really kept people moving. And that's what matters, is what keeps you moving. You might not always like the targets that something comes out, that something was used, but the byproduct can be really positive. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. In the battle between architecture and usability, architecture always won. Libraries were not about making them particularly useful for reading. Again, there was that wasn't quite true, I think, during Andrew Carnegie's time, right? The industrialist who had so much money that he there's this whole, the book talks about Carnegie really building a lot of what we think of now as the libraries throughout the U.S. and public access, and his were not necessarily as pretty, and they kind of had more utility to them. But by and large, architecture wins. And again, that's because the purpose of the library, whether you like it or not, was not really to be a place to access information, a storehouse it was more to show off, right, a city or a country's elitism, it's intellectualism, its ability to house knowledge, and look what we've created. So the architecture was more of a thing, and we see that with libraries today, right? And another example of this, I guess, I think, is a lot of people on Twitter, well, for people that I follow, I guess, anyways, they like to take pictures of their books a lot. I see this a lot on Twitter. It kind of annoys me. People just love doing this. They bought a book, they'll take a picture of it, or they'll show their bookcase, or they'll show their stack of their books. And often it's before they've even read them. They say, look at all the books I just got, and, you got to ask, why are people doing this, right? Why are people doing this? I don't care what books you're reading. I mean, I do. It's interesting because, book recommendations are good. I mean, I'm kind of doing that right now with my podcast, obviously. But this idea that you're taking a picture of all your books, especially before you've even read them. I mean, who's to say you're even going to read them? That ostentatious, that elitism, that intellectualism, I think we all kind of have that a little bit, right? There's something about having a shelf of books or a picture of all the books that you're going to read, as though that says something about your intellectual abilities or the knowledge. I don't know what it is. I don't have the words for it, right? But there's something in that. And I think that parallels what we see with libraries, right? It's not really about the reading. Hopefully you are going to read those books and you get something out of it. But it's not really about the reading, isn't it? Is it, when people take pictures of all the books and when people create big libraries? There's something else there. It's a bit of grandstanding, right? A grandstanding incentive. So I had this tweet back a while back where I said, never show off your personal wall of books unless you're ready to exhibit what you've built with all that borrowed knowledge. Never show off your personal wall of books unless you're ready to exhibit what you've built with all that borrowed knowledge. And so I'm just kind of poking fun at this idea of, people like to show off all the books, but it's like, well, what have you built with all that knowledge? Because if you haven't built anything with all that knowledge, what was the point of reading all that? And if it was just for your own entertainment, why would you be showing that off? I mean, it would make more sense to show off something that you've actually created, some value that you've added to the economy based on all this borrowed knowledge. And again, it's borrowed knowledge. I mean, you didn't even write those books. It's somebody else. Anyway, it just kind of bugs me. And I had this, this was in relation to another tweet, don't brag about being well-read. Reading requires almost no cognitive effort. Wanting to be respected for the mindless consumption of someone else's effort is embarrassing. When you build stuff, you don't need to brag, you just point. So I've got this thing where, it's really about creating. It's really about building. Don't get me wrong. I read all the time. I'm doing almost a book a week for this podcast, right? And you should consume. Consumption is important, but don't consume without creating is really what I'm saying here. And I had actually, I don't think I put it here. I had actually, there was a thing where people were kind of doing this ongoing thread, and they're trying to make it viral, where everybody takes a picture of their top 5 or 10 books or whatever it is. And I said, okay, fine, I'll take a picture of my books, but I said, I'll also show you, I forget, 3 or 5 different things that I'm working on. And I tried to get that going, and that wasn't very popular. People didn't want it. I was trying to get people to show the books, but also show the projects that they're working on. Because again, you shouldn't just consume, you should create. Anyway, that's kind of my take on it. So at the end of the day, it's borrowed knowledge. It's, if it's your books that you wrote, maybe that's a little bit different. But, go create something. Don't just consume, right? Go build something. It doesn't really say much to say you read a bunch of other people's words, right? Go do something. Anyway, that's my take. Probably offend some people, but whatever. So things happen for unrelated reason, right? And so the big message here is don't impose the targets, right? Don't look at the Musks of the world and say, you should be spending your money on this. Like you don't really understand where the progress is coming from. And if you look at the properties of systems, positive benefits rarely come from aiming at the thing directly. I don't think you're going to cure poverty by aiming at poverty. I think we can all agree it'd be great to end poverty, and I think a lot of that goes to the argument of, capitalism has lifted a lot of people out of poverty, whether you like it or not. And that's because the goal was not poverty. It's because, people were doing other things. They were inventing things and coming up with technologies for whatever the reason was. But then out of that came a lot of beneficial things. And that's just the way it works. So don't impose targets on people. And that's why I'm against overstructuring by, things like the government. The government's needed, for certain things. But and this is in business as well. It doesn't matter what the system is. If you overstructure it, if you over-design it, you're imposing targets. And that suggests that if you aim at something, that's what you're going to get out of it. But that's not the way it works. So all through history, book hunters, merchants, whether it's about political gain religious unification, elitism, the space race, right? The moon landing. People didn't land on the moon because they thought the moon was cool or for scientific reasons, right? We did not land on the moon for scientific reasons, we being the US. That's not why we landed on the moon, right? Is because there was a space race with Russia. It was political. It was politically charged. It was about elitism. It was about right showing off technology and accomplishment. It wasn't about the moon. Now, people who were involved in the project undoubtedly had scientific interests, right? That's the way it works. But so much of science is not done because of science, right? It has to have some other political, economic reason. Okay. Technology from war. We hear about this all the time, right? So much of technology came, after World War II, right? Right. So it was done for, arguably not great reasons, right? Although depending on a defensive or offensive position that you're taking, but war is generally agreed that's not a great thing. But so much technology ended up coming from that. So we have these unrelated targets. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to justify. Totally doesn't matter what the target is. Go do anything, but at the same time, it's too simplistic to look at something and say, well, you're not doing something for the right reason, right? Again, properties versus reasons. I talk about this all the time, right? Go back to the last episode, or quite a few episodes, right? Properties versus you can't know. Anyways, I'm not going to get into that now. The point is, don't impose the targets, right? The internet didn't come because people wanted to work on, it was kind of related in some sense. They were working on communication, but they weren't trying to get the world talking to each other. The current space race, right? Amazon and SpaceX, right? There's this kind of, in a way, it's dumb on the surface, where it's like, let's put billionaires into space, right? It's kind of sad on the surface, right? We have people putting rockets into space, and what's the ticket price? A few $100,000, $1 million. What does it cost to go to space right now? $1 million if you're just an average citizen, right? Not average economically, but average. If I'm not an astronaut, how do I get to space? It's probably going to cost me about $1 million, and it's only going to be just above the stratosphere or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, what is that, right? I mean, that's ridiculous, But even though that is stupid on the surface to many people, out of that profit motive and charging people $1 million, that's going to start something. And eventually, because this always happens, things get cheaper, things get more ubiquitous, the price comes down, and all of a sudden you've got this space tourism, and then that turns into something maybe even more publicly accessible. And that's how innovations happen. So make it less about imposing the targets on people, like this is what you're supposed to be working on, right? It has to be a specific purpose. It's just not how progress happens. It's not how things grow, right? As long as people are doing things. I had this tweet recently. Those who create good in the world do so as a byproduct of their self-interests. Those who do damage in the world do so by aiming their efforts directly at world problems. Okay, maybe it's a bit strong, but honestly, I think this is largely true. I'll do it again. Those who create good in the world do so as a byproduct of their self-interests. Hopefully their self-interests are still positive, but that's what it is. Can't get away from that. Those who do damage in the world are often, anyways, doing so by aiming their efforts directly at world problems. And that doesn't mean they're trying to do damage, right? A lot of people are doing things for good reasons. If you want to make the world a better place, you might aim at poverty, you might aim at disease, right? But that doesn't mean that's where the solutions are going to come from. We still have to be realistic about how things happen. So don't impose those targets. Ultimately, why is the library still here? Let's go back to the library. Well, it's interesting. The library is kind of one of the few places where you're generally not being recommended to, right? So if you think about the modern age, the library stands in stark contrast to the ubiquity of information, right? It does. I mean, we have just access to anything we want pretty much on the internet. Why do we bother going to the library? Well, libraries are these slow thinking spaces, right, that are away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. And I think we really crave that. And more to the point, in the digital age, almost everything is done through recommendation algorithms, right? We can't get out of these echo chambers, right? Whether it's Twitter, or whether it's Facebook or some other social media platform, even things that get emailed to us, even within our own companies that we work for, the information has this feedback loop, and it's got this echo chamber aspect to it. And because the technology, so much of the technologies that we use have these recommendation algorithms behind them. So if I click on this, what's going to get surfaced to me is more of that, right? And it's not, whether it's an advertisement or anything, any part of the technology, it's like as soon as you touch it, it starts to give you more of what you touched. And there's some benefit to that, I suppose, right? But there's also this kind of really annoying, like, look, just because I showed some interest in this doesn't mean I just want that. I want difference. I want something to be distinct. So the library is the one place you can go and you can just browse. You can just browse. I mean, the interesting thing is you can't really just browse on the internet anymore. You can't. You can't really it's really hard to just browse on the internet, even though that word browse we normally associate with browsers, right? But browsers are not really for browsing, because so much of it is being fed by recommendation algorithms that I can't get out of that echo chamber that I didn't even want to create. As soon as I click anything, there's this reinforcing feedback loop that keeps me into those things that I clicked, that type of information, those types of people, right? What if I just wanted to browse, right? Well, you kind of have to go to something like a library for that, a physical library to do that. I don't want to be recommended to. If I go purchase a book on Amazon, that doesn't mean I want all those types of books being recommended from that day on. Like, go away. I just want to browse. I want to be exposed to things that are surprising, things that I don't know. And so the library, which has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it looks kind of like a relic from the past in a way. You've got these physical bound books, but I can just go browse in the library. I can get surprised. I can be presented with something that I wasn't, quote unquote, supposed to be presented to, right? And so away from the hustle and bustle and away from the it's the place to go without being recommended to, which is super refreshing. So if you haven't done it in a while, I would go walk around a library, physical library, because a lot of people don't realize just how much they're getting recommended. They're on your smartphone all the time. And we don't realize just how much we're getting recommended to. We don't realize how much our experience has been kind of engineered for us. Not explicitly, like, but there's this targeting of advertisements, and because the algorithms that back all the products that you're using are shaping what you see and hear, right? And there's not much ability to browse anymore, to just be exposed to new possibilities, and it can change your life. I mean, it can. I mean, it comes down to the statistical sampling from the possibility space, right? You need to go sample from the possibility space. Go spin that telescope randomly and see where it lands in the sky, right? That's how tractability to complex problems works. That's how growth works. That's how opportunity really happens. And one of the few places you can do that now is the physical library, because it stands in stark contrast to the connected, echo chambered, feedback looped technology landscape that we find ourselves in. So go to the library, go walk around, go sample some new possibilities in ways that you just can't do using today's technology. Sounds crazy, but it's true. Okay, so that is it for this episode. So I know that was about libraries. Maybe at the beginning, some of you thought that was going to be a little bit boring. I don't know. Library sounds kind of dated, and is that really interesting? But hopefully you saw that there are a lot of core patterns in there, because it's about information, because it's about control and censorship, and a lot of things that are relevant today. So hopefully that all made sense, and you found that interesting. I have a video that I'm going to show now. I know that for anyone who is not on Patreon, you won't be able to see this, but for those who are on Patreon, you'll be able to see the video. It's just a short compilation of some beautiful libraries. So I show the library. I show where, what country it comes from. It's only about a minute and a half. I think it's no more than 2 minutes. But you can see some nice libraries, and you can see the importance of architecture, right? Being much more important than the contents of the library. It's got a little background music to it. So let's go ahead and watch that now. Again, with those with audio only, you'll get to just enjoy the music. Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that. So again, for those who like some of the additional media that I add to my non-trivial episodes, go ahead and head on over to patreon.com/non-trivial and check that out. A little bit of money each month gets you some extra content, but again, the audio is exactly the same. I've got some references at the end, some Wikipedia articles related to the concepts, of course, the book itself, the library, a fragile history, got a Nature article on there with a publication related to some complexity stuff. And just some additional reading. So thanks again to everyone. Hope you enjoyed that episode. Until next time, take care.